our symposium on careers in Russian, and thank you very, very much to our panelists who've come from near and far to speak to us. I also want to thank Lady Ortiz-Rothman for doing a lot of organizational work to pull this together. So I'm Ann Malmesbury, the chair of the Department of Russian Slavic Studies, and I'm going to very briefly announce who are, or introduce our panelists. On the end, we have Stephen Halliwel, who is the principal of SEH Advisors and the managing director of the Collectors Fund and the co-founder of ID for Arts, correct? And he was Citibank's corporate finance head for the former Soviet Union and Central Europe in the early 90s, left to become chief financial officer of the U.S.-Russia Investment Fund in 1994. And as I understand it, his main message is, and this is a message that I love, that new opportunities are emerging for speakers of Russian as Russia gradually is assimilated into what we think of as, I would describe as sort of world financial standards.
The civilized world, as my Russian friends like to say.
Okay, as we can call it the civilized world, right? And so thank you very much for coming. And next we have Ksenia Nouril. And Ksenia, Ms. Nouril is a PhD candidate in art history at Rutgers and a New York-based independent scholar and curator. So it's interesting to have the arts represented here, specializing in Central and East European art. She received a BA in 2009, worked briefly in commercial art, and then started her PhD in art history at Rutgers. But throughout most of this time, she's also been working with the Nancy and Norton Dodge collection of non-conformist art from the Soviet Union. So I assume you know that collection very well. And working as a researcher and a Mellon Fellow at MoMA, again specializing in Central and East European art, and she is currently finishing her dissertation. I just heard her say the words pishu, right? I'm writing, right? Okay, and we have Ambassador Carey Cavanaugh, who is currently a professor of diplomacy and conflict resolution at the University of Kentucky at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce. And he joined the University of Kentucky after a 22-year diplomatic career with the U.S. Department of State, focused on peace and humanitarian issues. Under Presidents Clinton and Bush, he spearheaded or helped advance peace efforts involving Armenia, Azerbaijan, Cyprus, Georgia, Greece, Moldova, Tajikistan, and Turkey. So that's a good list of places to have peace, right? Originally from Florida, Ambassador Cavanaugh majored in Russian at the University of Florida. In graduate school at Notre Dame, he studied international affairs and Soviet and East European studies. Later attended the U.S. Army Russian Institute in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Speaks Russian and German. Okay. And we have our own Ilaria Parogni, who is a graduate of our NYU master's program. It's a joint master's program in journalism and Russian and Slavic studies, where she was one of our star students and has done very interesting work covering Russia for the last few years and is currently at the New York Times. We have Captain Michael Bradwick, who is a graduate student in our department as well, pursuing a master's in Russian and Slavic studies. And he's currently a European Foreign Area Officer in the U.S. Army, graduated with honors from the United States Military Academy, where he studied operations research, did other various trainings in the military, and received a Master's of Science in Engineering Management from Missouri University of Science and Technology, and then in May 2014 switched career areas and started learning Russian, completed Russian training, language training in 2015 at Monterey, and he has served in Germany, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Korea, and has spent briefer stints at U.S. embassies in Lithuania and Ukraine. And finally, we have Melissa Graves, who is with the Alfa Fellowship Program, the director of the Alfa Fellowship Program, which places American graduates in Russia. And we're very grateful to this program and to Melissa because some of our own students have participated and had extremely good experiences. So thank you all so much, and I'll let you go for it. If you want to speak in order, that's fine, or if you just want to interrupt each other, that's fine too.
There's someone waiting outside.
Oh, is there? Are they feeling shy?
I do.
Come on in, don't be shy, it's fine. You can just send it in.
Can you hear me the program? So who would like to start? Okay, any preferences? Good, I'll start. My understanding is you're students here at NYU, and that some of you may be looking at Russian in terms of finance, economics as a possible career path. And I can't speak to literature or diplomatic service, but I can speak to the financial side. Can I just ask for, in terms of the number of people here who are thinking that sort of thing right now, how many people have an interest in the sort of financial side of things? Looks like you struck out. Well, there's one. Okay.
And you can't always believe when students raise their hands or don't raise their hands, I can say.
Okay, then let me speak just a little bit personally about how I became involved and why I went the direction I did and what opportunities I think that provides for you. I grew up out in Paterson, New Jersey, and I had Russian-speaking neighbors at the age of 14. And this was the middle of the Cold War, and people from Russia were not the evil empire yet, that was Reagan, but this was a very strange thing. The children didn't speak any English, and I spoke no Russian, and then we started teaching each other words. And then as an undergrad, as a high school student, I read Dostoevsky, I read some Tolstoy. I became very involved in Russian. I did Russian studies at Wesleyan, and I did graduate work in Russian history and economics at Columbia. Basically trying to figure out what would have happened if the Bolsheviks hadn't won. How would Russia have evolved economically? How would they have become part of Europe or not part of Europe? So, long story short, I taught college for a little while, but I wound up at Citibank right as Perestroika was beginning, which was a very unique period in the history of Russia. So you had the Tsar, you had the Russian Revolution, and you had the Soviet Union, and then that system was in a state of collapse by 1985. It's hard to have a sense of it, but from a financial or economic standpoint, there was no payment system in Russia. So you couldn't write a check to someone and send it. There were no credit cards. There were no banks as we know them. Banks were just state institutions that took some rubles and they said, go build that in communist Czechoslovakia or go build that in Moldova. There were no telephone books because that would be subversive. So basically this is a country functioning without any of the infrastructure that we're familiar with and that we live with every day. The Yeltsin period opened up the window for us to make a real contribution over there, and a lot of us who went in weren't really necessarily such business types as we were interested in bringing this country into the market economy because we saw the market economy is somehow tied to democratic values, and that would be good for Russia after a period of totalitarian rule. So there were a lot of things that got built in that period. A stock market for the first time. We literally picked up the software that runs the NASDAQ system. You know what NASDAQ is, the over-the-counter market? We took software over there, it was the out-of-date system, and set it up there, and people could begin trading. There were people running through the streets, delivering shares, paper shares, because they now had a stock market. A bond market was created with a great deal of Western help. Central bank regulation. Rules for how companies resolve disputes were written by Americans and then handed to the Russian parliament where they would just stamp them and send them through. Huge amount of infrastructure was built in that period. And Yeltsin failed, but very little recognition is given to the fact that a lot of people of goodwill and good energy went in to try to make Russia part of the Western world in the sense of those economic functions that we believe, I believe at least, support democracy. So the Yeltsin period ends, Putin comes in, and Putin used all of that machinery in order to consolidate power for himself, and he still uses it today. There's a functioning banking system, the central bank keeps the ruble under control, keeps inflation under control. So my point is, there's a very, very narrow window in which we were doing an experiment, and the experiment didn't fail in the sense that it got the building blocks in place. It's just that it's being run by a totalitarian system again. A system that wants to tell you that you can't write certain kinds of poems, and you can't express certain views, and you can't hold up certain flags, and you can't say certain things on television. So it looks really dark right now. But the Putin system is going to fail at some point because it's so corrupt. And if I were an undergraduate at this point and had a fascination even about Russia, and here's where it gets a little pragmatic, I would be thinking about 3 different ways in which I could maybe engage an involvement in Russia in something that was about both their economic health and what democracy means for Russia, what that would. The first was what I would call buy and hold. Do you know what that is in the stock market? Buy and hold is you buy a stock and you don't plan to flip it, sell it very quickly. You're going to hold on to it and let it grow in value. If you brought Russian studies into a program where you were doing comparative economics or developmental economics, because Russia is still a developing country, and you had Russian plugged in as a part of that, it may turn out that 3 years from now, Putin fails catastrophically, because, footnote, things in Russia happened catastrophically, right? The Tsar went away like overnight. The Soviet Union went away overnight. Because if you build rigidity into a system by having one tyrant at the top, you can't ventilate political tensions, and you can't get economic innovation going on. So it may happen. And then that becomes a very valuable credential, because once again we'll be back to that 90s kind of situation where they're going to be saying, we need a lot of help. This guy's been sitting on top of us. $1.3 trillion has been exported from that country under Putin. Money taken out of oil sales and minerals and diamonds and sent out of the country so people could buy big apartments in London and yachts and maybe elections, right? So that's buy and hold. The second one would be to plunge in, to say, I want to join one of the big companies that are in Russia, and to Mars, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Ford Motor. They've all cut their deal. They know how to work with a corrupt regime. They know who has to be taken care of. And when somebody comes in and says, you got to take care of me, they know who to call, who then says to that person who's arriving, leave them alone, right? You have to. So you could conceivably, if your passion was to live in Russia and to experience that culture close up, make an alliance, find a career within one of those companies, because they need people, they need competent people. It's a hard choice because it's a very limited number of options at this point. There aren't that many Russian companies that I could say you could go to work for as a non-Russian speaking, as a native, someone who's studied it and learned it, but for whom it's not in your blood, and be successful within it, because there's still so much intrigue that's built around the way in which corruption changes things. The third one I call Elliot Ness. What we're seeing in this election campaign process shows the need for people who are really good at figuring out organized crime and breaking it. And that's hardcore, tough stuff. But if your passion is to figure out how money laundering is going on, to break the back of organized crime when it's doing everything from sex trafficking to stealing elections, because I firmly believe the Russians were very heavily involved in our election, then there are a lot of career opportunities for you right now. I'm sure other panelists may be able to speak to that, but it's that crossover between traditional economics and government regulation, government control, government prosecution. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We'll move on and let everyone talk for a minute, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Daniel.
So I think it's kind of appropriate I speak next, not just because our fields are quite different, but I think quite related. First and foremost, I have my higher education studies in graduate school to thank to an economist, Norton Dodge. But to backtrack a little bit, I'll start at the very beginning. Since it wasn't that long ago, I was a bachelor's student here at NYU. I originally was a journalism and Slavic studies major, but I just couldn't hack it. And quickly after my first year changed to art history, and I didn't really know how I would combine the two. I had taken Russian history, the core curriculum class that in that year Yanni Kotsonis was teaching. I honestly took it for an easy A. So my family's from Ukraine. I'm second generation. I grew up here in New York City, and I thought, hey, first semester in college, trying to get used to things. Let me do something that I maybe have some sense of the history or the culture. One thing, of course, led to another. I started taking Ukrainian at an advanced level through the consortium at Columbia University, which does allow you to take, I think, still some languages that are not taught downtown. And then I started to take Russian, actually with Professor Belodedova here in my second year. So, one thing, just led to the next, and I became absolutely obsessed. And I found myself in this total black hole where every summer I had to go, I was desperate to go to Eastern Europe. I spent a summer at NYU in Prague, a summer in Lviv, Ukraine, and then 2 summers through the Critical Language Studies scholarship sponsored by the State Department in Nizhny Novgorod and in Tomsk. And honest to God, I'm a girl from Queens, and у меня сибирская душа, like 100%. And so, going back to the art history thing, I didn't know how I would combine the two. Our history department here, at least when I was a student, didn't have a lot of support for Eastern Europe, global topics. Thankfully, I had Professor Groys on my side, and cobbling together his work with my work with another professor in art history, I wrote an honors thesis on contemporary art in Ukraine and Romania. And I got to go to Ukraine through this Dean Scholarship or something like that. And I remember the very first time, I was going to Ukraine, I was trying to meet artists, and it all started with a phone number. Someone was like, okay, when you get there, call this person. And I was like, oh my God, how am I gonna call this person? Well, obviously I had to speak the language. And knowing Russian, knowing Ukrainian, and subsequently in graduate school, I studied Czech and Polish. I also work in Lithuania too. Nice tidbit with you, where I sometimes use Russian. I was able to go to all of these places and talk to artists. And yeah, people know English. You look at Moscow and you look at these, major exhibition spaces run by oligarchs, and those people are circulating within the global art market and the global art world. They bring in foreign curators. They're constantly exchanging programs and exhibitions with places here in New York or in London. However, you go the extra mile when you know the language, and you become that much closer to the people you're working with, to the artists that you're studying and you're trying to develop relationships with. And one thing sort of leads to another. People start to trust you. People start to ask you to write about them, to maybe co-organize something with them. And little by little, you build up your network. And I was able to concurrently pursue my graduate studies at Rutgers, where there is an invaluable collection, if you aren't aware, the largest collection of Soviet nonconformist art in the United States, and absolutely one of the largest in the world, rivaling. I've had people from the Trichkov Gallery tell me that it holds works that even they don't have, just 45 minutes south in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And so choosing a graduate program where I could, one, be funded, because let's not mince words, I do work now in the arts, and I don't know, maybe the financial sector I would advise you to move towards, as this field is not as maybe lucrative. So having my graduate studies paid for, being able to work with this material, to continue to combine my Russian and other Slavic languages and passions and knowledge with art history and with curating, and then to also be very close to New York, where I was able to build a relationship with the Museum of Modern Art. And the Museum of Modern Art has approximately over 700 employees, and for the majority of the time I worked there, I was the only Russian speaker working within their, let's say, curatorial program. So making a concerted effort to research Russian artists from the former Soviet Union, to plan programmings, and also to publish our research and our collaborations with our colleagues in Russia and in other countries of the former Soviet Union. So it was really incredible for me to take 20 of my senior colleagues, and mind you, I'm still, remember, lowly graduate student, to Moscow, some of them for the first time. And believe me, I mean, maybe to you and me, Russia is very accessible. Oh, I was in Russia 5 times last year. I have an open visa. I'm always going. Oh, Moscow this, St. Petersburg that. For them, it was like, I don't know, I think it was you who said banking in Russia is like going to the moon. For them, it was like going to the moon. They had a very successful trip in the end, but there was a lot of trepidation. And having someone with them, me, who was able to just jump right in, to speak Russian, I mean, literally, like for every little thing, from ordering a taxi to you show up in an artist's studio and you realize his English wasn't as good as he told you it would be. And basically, you're there to impart that information about that artist to the curators, to your colleagues. You don't want the artist to be unable to really express himself well. You want him to be able to have the opportunity to tell them exactly what his work is about. So you just have to get yourself together, and maybe you're not going to translate everything perfectly, but you just step up to the plate and you just let it roll. And the more you immerse yourself, the more you take advantage of those opportunities. Even if you're going to speak really poorly and make 1,000 mistakes, honestly, every little mistake is a lesson you can learn the next time you say that phrase, or the next time you want to tell someone like how tired you are because you had too much fun last night at the disco. But whatever way you go about it, I just say, take those risks, put yourself out there. And if you're passionate about something, whether it's economics or art or diplomacy, there is a way you can combine it. Language will never fail you. You can always talk your way out of it or into it. So, so yeah, keep at it. I'm still studying Russian. My Russian still needs a lot of work. So.
Работа на всю жизнь.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Thank God
Work.
Professor Bilodanova and I reconnected. Maybe I can get some lessons later.
Thank you so much.
So I like that, but I don't know if I can agree with language will never fail you.
Oh.
Sometimes it can fail you miserably. But,
Enlighten me, please.
later. First, congratulations on a really wise choice of languages to pick. Since most of you are young, you may not realize it. 60 years ago, English was the language of commerce. Italian was the language of art. French was the language of diplomacy. German and Russian were the language of science. And if it had stayed that way, a whole bunch of languages would be really good, and you wouldn't have governors across the United States saying, close these departments at our universities, because why are people learning these languages? You picked a language that has remained salient, though not the language of science or art or commerce. In fact, those languages now in our modern day are all English. So you have a wonderful advantage, you speak English. You have a disadvantage, everybody who doesn't speak English has huge incentives to learn English. So indeed, there are lots of native speakers of Russian who have great English. Because if they didn't, they're never going to get a job. But what your Russian selection does is open up a whole bunch of jobs you may or may not think about. I started with Italian. My mother was an artist. We lived in Italy. I came back to Florida speaking Italian. You had to take a language in high school. All they offered were Spanish and French. I thought that'll destroy this lovely Italian, which was really good for dating. It was, I think, sexier sounding than French. Certainly more romantic. But Florida at that point was deciding to offer Russian because they saw Russia was really important, but they weren't really sure about it. So I had Russian in 9th and 10th grade, and then they stopped teaching it because Florida had decided if you had more than 2 years of Russian, you'd probably become a communist. So they would switch it to other schools. And I'm telling you about this because it's going to be important later. This is an issue in the United States. Russian is a great language that's really important and really needed, but if you have too much of it, we start worrying about you. I did not plan on having a career in Russian studies, but I did fall for Russian literature hard. Lermontov was a passion, Pushkin was a passion. That's why I put Superfluous Life down here. If you're into Russian literature, you know, those things stick with you. And my career will look very linear, all Russian. But in fact, it didn't necessarily have that predetermined trajectory. It ended up with it. But the important thing is I discovered Russian opened a number of opportunities in graduate studies because the United States is really worried about Russia. So we fund lots of programs, and if you're undergraduates, this is really important, you can go do graduate work in Russian studies, Slavic studies, a lot of places, and there's money for it. And there's not a lot of money for graduate programs in art history. But if you're doing Slavic and art history, you may find we'll fund that, often under defense programs, but you don't have any requirement to do anything related to defense. We recognize the need to have people in the United States who speak Russian. If you speak Russian, when you enter the job market, there are a whole bunch of jobs where all those wonderful native speakers of Russian are not your competitors because we don't really trust them. They speak Russian too well. Why they speak Russian may be a problem. And we can talk later if your parents are immigrants and you're a naturalized citizen or any of that may not be an issue for you. But all those people in Russia who would like your job can't get those jobs. And there are a lot of jobs, if you have a Russian specialization, that indeed you then rise to the top. We'll help pay for you to get it, and then there are places that will hire you. State Department's one, FBI would be another. I think Facebook and Twitter are about to be in need of a huge number of non-Russian born Russian speakers. Actually, the people doing those bad Facebook and Twitter ads, if you looked at them, also need native English speakers. So you might find jobs over there too, but different. What I want to focus on is public sector. There's a lot of public sector jobs where Russian is really important. Some may appeal to you a lot. Diplomacy is really neat, and I'll be glad to answer questions and talk about that. National Security Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, and FBI, which I mentioned, all hiring Russian speakers. They're showing up at the Modern Language Association conventions now. They need a lot of people, and there aren't that many people. You're studying a language that simply is not taught widely in the United States. We produce many more people still who speak French, but we don't really have a need for the French. We almost produce as many who speak German and Italian, but both of those are suffering now. And there's not a lot of need for those, but for Russian there is. So there are a lot of public careers where I think you can do quite well. In my little comment, I was reluctant to give a blurb, and then I gave a semi-literary blurb. The problem if you're a student of Russian literature is particularly the mainstream Tolstoy, Turgenev, Pushkin. Everything you read says don't work for the government. The horrible jobs. All these superfluous men are superfluous because they're Nicholas I and others are. Nobody would be with the government. Those were the jobs that were boring and dead end and would drive you crazy, and the best thing you could do is go have a duel with somebody and get killed. And if not, kill yourself. You know, have a dream about, no, that's a That's the best excuse for it. But jobs with government aren't like the ones you will have read about in Russian literature. A lot of them are really amazing. You can have jobs, I had one, that will put you in places where history is happening. You get to see history unfold. Depending, you get to help shape it. And depending on which parts of all those places I mentioned you might be interested in working, you get to talk about it or not. I fortunately am in one where I can talk about it. Others do really amazing things they can't talk about, but they know they've done really amazing things. The financial remuneration falls in the middle of the three of us. Not near yours, much higher, not close to yours. But if money isn't your prime objective in life, but having a really interesting and a good life, I think there are a variety of ways in public service work you can convert your Russian language degrees and your interest in Russia or Slavic studies into a very interesting career. And I'd like to add a little plug for the nonprofit sector. There's a lot of jobs in the nonprofit sector that need Russian too. So if you really get excited about the State Department, that's cool, and you really get turned off by the NSA and the CIA, there are people on the do-good side of the spectrum that are working on peace efforts around the world, that are working to eliminate nuclear weapons, that are working on developmental projects in Russia and in places where people speak Russian languages, that also are looking very hard for people with Russian language skills. I'm on the board of one in the United Kingdom, and we constantly are in trouble because you can't find people with solid enough Russian. So think of both of those areas as places where you could take advantage of the skill set you've chosen and also end up with a very personally rewarding career. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much. Ilaria.
Before I start saying how much of a no-brainer it is to choose journalism and Russian right now, I'm just gonna start with like the one question I think like every Russian student gets asked, which is why Russian? And when I started studying Russian, I didn't really have an answer for it. I was at UCL in London and I was given a choice of 3 languages. One was Italian, the other was Dutch, and then Russian. I'm Italian. Dutch didn't really feel like the ideal choice, so I just went for the one that was the most mysterious to me, which was Russian. And I started studying the language and the culture and the politics, and little by little I became like more and more fascinated with the culture, and in particular by how dysfunctional and misunderstood that kind of culture is. And being Italian, I really felt that very strongly. And so I guess my point is, I don't think that without falling in love with Russia, I would have chosen the kind of career that I'm, the kind of trajectory that I'm now on, which is that of, you know, a career in journalism. And I think it's the idea of like delving deep into a country that we have a lot of misconceptions about. It's a very unique advantage for you guys. It really like teaches you to look at the world in a very different way. And so when I started, I didn't know anything about Russian journalism and Russian society, and little by little I just started becoming so engrossed in all these different aspects of it. Like I wanted to understand more about, you know, here people talk about Russian propaganda. I just wanted to understand where did that come from, and why wasn't there a culture of journalism that was as flourishing in Russia as it is elsewhere in the world. So this is how it all got started, and then like by learning about Russian journalism, I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on the freedom of the press in Russia. I just somehow became even more interested in the journalism aspect of it, and so that's how I landed at NYU and choosing this specific program, which is a joint program in journalism and Russian, and which was probably one of the best periods of my life, especially from a professional point of view. During this time, I got to travel to Russia. I got to intern at the Moscow Times. I got to do in-depth reporting on issues that I really cared about, from transgender issues in Russia to the anti-abortion movement. And I got to collaborate with really great publications, and I don't think I would have been able to do all of that if I hadn't chosen a degree in Russian in the first place. And right now I am working at the New York Times. I am in a section in a department that's called the Syndicate. So I guess I'm moving a little bit further away from the Russian part of it, but I still have like plenty of opportunities to use the skills that I've developed here. And the Syndicate works a lot with international clients and curates content from the New York Times and other publications that then gets sold to clients around the world. So we need to select the kind of content that can, be appealing to a Russian audience rather than a Spanish audience. And again, having been immersed in a specific environment like this, and having traveled to Russia and learned about the culture for so long, definitely gives you an advantage. You start to see the world and like to see the way people think in a very different way. And yeah, I mean, there's that, and then there are the perks of the job. Like, I just finished working on a story with Khodorkovsky, and I spent like quite a few days fact checking his content, and like I'm the only person that reads Russian, and his staff just sent us a bunch of surveys, so I spent days and days just looking at the surveys and telling my colleagues what it all meant. God just finished interviewing a Russian scientist that is trying to bring back this ancient ecosystem in Siberia, and so it's all like extremely exciting. So I don't want to really go into why it's so great to work in journalism right now, because I think it's pretty obvious, but I guess my point would be that really it's a very great way to get rid of all your preconceptions, and it allows you maybe to just make Russia, like hopefully it will allow you to make Russia understood a little bit better outside of the few things that people know about Russia, especially right now.
Thank you so much, Ilaria. Mike.
Yeah, I want to echo the other panel members. It is a very enriching language to learn. I'm a career military guy. I've been in about 10.5 years. I served 7 years conventional engineers, and then I switched over to what I'm doing now. And when I switched over in 2013, it was, before Crimea, before Donbass. It wasn't really important, but right as I was starting language training, Crimean annexation happened, Donbass happened, and suddenly my language became important. Everyone was asking me, hey, what's going to happen to you? Where are you going to go after this? Before I forget, I want to also say that the language of space is Russian, so NASA astronauts learn Russian, so that's another interesting side note. My career conventionally took me to Germany, South Korea, and then detours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when I was stationed in Germany, I had a unique opportunity to basically travel the whole continent, both with partner training exercises, other militaries, but also in my own free time. And what I noticed is, for the first 2 years I was there, I was only traveling to European Union countries, EU countries, and pretty much everywhere I went, people spoke English. Then all of a sudden, about 2 years into my 3-year stint in Germany, I decided to, go off the deep end, so to speak, and I went out to Ukraine, outside the EU, and I was totally mind blown. This was 2010, before the new airport was built in Kiev. And very few people spoke English there. The economy was much different. It didn't have the infrastructure, the modern infrastructure that the Western societies that we're used to. So that's what kind of drew me to the language, drew me to the culture, was that first trip I took to Ukraine. I followed it up in 2012 with a personal trip to Vladivostok, Russia. And again, that's what solidified my choice to go down this route. So it is very enriching, but the best aspect of learning Russian, I'd say, is it'll open up new doors that you didn't see previously. For example, last year I was in Prague, Czech Republic, and I hopped into a taxi driver, and basically any taxi driver in the EU, you assume they speak English. Well, this guy didn't speak any English, but then I just asked him, it's like, hey, вы говорите по-русски? And he immediately responded and said, yeah. So I was able to navigate to this reunion party I was going to that night. And had I not known Russian, I would not have been able to do that. I would have had to go find another cab, of course. It probably wouldn't have been a big deal, but it did offer me an opportunity to connect with someone on a personal level that even had he spoken English, he probably wouldn't have told me a few things that he did, because he told me a few unique things about the Soviet Union on that taxi car ride. I've used the Russian language not only in Russia, but also Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, of course the whole former Soviet Union. Prague, I've used it with certain diaspora communities in the West, Russian speakers. So we'll open up doors, and even if you decide to not go into a career that's going to be Russian focused, it'll still give you dividends, the cultural aspects I'm just naming right there. But as for the military, and I don't want to sound like a recruiter, but they'll pay back your student loans, they will give you food, clothing, and shelter, they'll give you a salary. If you want to go into a Russian career right away, you can get a job as like a translator, a linguist, an intelligence analyst. They'll train you in Russian, so they'll pay for the school and pay you on top of that. And for a year, you can go to Monterey, California, or Washington, D.C., learn the language full time, and really get into the nuts and bolts of the language, the grammar, verbs of motion, all that stuff. So, yeah, the recurring theme I got in Europe, though, was EU countries most of them had a pretty solid grasp of English, but once I step outside of that, it changes. So knowing Russian will help you go to a place like Ukraine. Last summer I was in Ukraine. I used the Russian language with the Ukrainian army. Right now we have a big training mission trying to reform the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. So I used it with some of the older officers. Our training mission was in Western Ukraine, which isn't really a Russian-friendly place, so to speak. But they had me out there, basically syncing what we were doing with the embassy. So in my field, Ambassador Cavanaugh would be like the 5-star general. He's like the god as the ambassador in Kiev or whatever embassy you're at. So I'm in a unique field now to where I have to answer the military and have to answer to, ambassadors to the Department of State. So it's a unique role. But if you don't, the role I'm doing is a little bit different than what you would do if you immediately jumped into language as like a linguist, interpreter, intelligence analyst. But that's a good option if you don't know exactly what you want to do after you graduate and you want to further improve your language skills. You will improve out there. And then another thing what Ambassador Cavanaugh said is if you're not a Russian heritage speaker, you are more in demand actually. One of my friends that's in my same career field, he was born in St. Petersburg and then came to America beginning of the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he can never be sent to Russia because of that aspect, because of his Russian name. So he can only go to, the other 14 countries outside of Russia, but he cannot go there. Whereas I, as an Anglo-American, have a little bit different opportunity than he does, even though I don't know the languages nearly as well as he does. He's completely fluent. I'm, struggling to get by sometimes. But the military will also offer numerous classes, refresher classes after your initial training too. So there is plenty of opportunities. And again, if you don't decide to go into a field that's heavy with Russian, it will open dividends, I think, largely through travel. And you will see, you have to just kind of hunt and seek it down. You will find it out there.
Thank you so much, Mike. Yes,
Right. Well, I have to start with a disclaimer. I was a German studies major, not a Russian studies major, so I don't know if I have to apologize for that here or not, but what's really, really cool about language is no matter what language you study, it's going to bring you somewhere, and it'll always be to somewhere that you didn't expect it to bring you at all. And when you look back and you're like, oh, that's so strange, that because I studied German, I ended up doing something with Russia. And so my path was, after I went to UCLA and I did my German studies and European studies, that was a new thing. It was 1992 when I graduated, and the EU was just kind of coming together, and so I was in the very first class of European studies majors, which sounds so funny now because there are all these European institutes all over. And after that I did an internship in the Bundestag, so in the German parliament. And this was a program that brought together, it was kind of a hodgepodge of programs that all finally got brought under one umbrella. We were Americans, French, Eastern Europeans, and Russians, and then all just thrown together and traveled around the country and did our internships in the Bundestag. One of the Russians on the program invited a friend of me to visit him. He was from Nizhny Novgorod. And so we went over, went to Moscow, went there. It was in 1998, right before the big currency, the first big currency collapse. And I left and I said, oh, I'm definitely coming back here again. That was just the coolest 10 days of my life. It was really neat. And because of German, it led me there, so that was pretty neat. I went to graduate school, started studying the language, and then in the summer between the first and second year, I went to Russia and was studying the HIV/AIDS epidemic there for a paper. And then, as I always seem to do in those days, I ended up always just kind of going, oh, that sounds like a good idea. And next thing you know, I was in Novosibirsk at a camp for kids who were brought over from 1,000 kilometers further east, all the way to east to Novosibirsk, and we hung out for 2 weeks and studied English, and their English was phenomenal because they were from closed cities and their parents were all nuclear physicists and doctors, and it was just just one of those really cool experiences that you get to have in life. When I after graduate school, I went and lived in Russia for 2 years. I lived in Kazan. And one of the participants, again, back on that Bundestag program, I ended up marrying one of them. So now I'm very connected to Russia. I'm one of the Russian participants. We eventually moved here to New York, and I now work for the nonprofit sector. So thank you for the shout out to our sector. I appreciate that. I work in international exchange now at an organization called Cultural Vistas. So we have headquarters here in New York, and we also have a DC office and a Berlin office. And we administer about 30 different programs and have about 6,000 participants going through our organization a year. So there is study abroad, and what we do is not that, we do work abroad. So our mission is really to give professionals, young professionals, experienced professional students an opportunity to go abroad to get tangible work experience, and then to be able to come home and apply that in their future careers. So my particular area that I work on is I'm the program director for the Alfa Fellowship Program. And this is what we consider a high-level fellowship program, fully funded for individuals 25 to 35 years of age from the US, UK, and Germany to spend 11 months in Russia, basically doing professional development training. So we have the equivalent of about a year of language training, of Russian language training incorporated into the program, and then about 7 months of professional development training. So we have fellows going over in the fields of, I think, everyone's fields, in business, media, political science, economics. We actually even have someone on the program this year who is an aeronautical engineer, which is a first. We have somebody there this year who's in pharma as well. So it's just a really great program to bring together the Russian interest, the professional interest, and then have tangible work experience there in country. An alum of this program was in the program last year. Did all of his education in Russian studies and then got a law degree and is now working as a lawyer in Moscow. So really, big Russophile brought together that interest together with his professional interest. Another one of our alumni, she did the BEAS program at Stanford, so an equivalent program. She was working locally in the government in Washington State, ended up doing the program, working in communications in Moscow, and now she's at EurasiaNet here in New York. And I'll give you one more example. Again, another alum who studied at the Stanford's BEAS program. He went over to Moscow, did his fellowship working at Cargill, and he's now working at Eurasia Group and doing risk analysis. So I think doing language study is so important, and one language often leads to another language very unexpectedly, and it definitely leads just to great experiences getting out there. In my field, we do cultural diplomacy, so it's so neat to see what that means, especially in today's environment. And it also is just neat to see the amount of growth that participants go through. I send participants off. We meet them in Washington in the spring. We do an orientation there. And then I don't see them for a year. And then I get to meet up with them in Moscow after a year. And just the amount of growth that I see after that year, it's just really remarkable. It's one of my favorite things to do is just to sit down with each of them and say, how was your year? And then just to hear about the experiences they all had. It's really heartwarming. So international education is a great field, international exchange. So this is also an option for people who study languages. So maybe something to think about as well. And it's very cyclical, so it's not something that you go into and it's not the same thing every day at all. In fact, when we interview people to work at Cultural Vistas, they always say, in the interview, I think this is a standard question you're supposed to ask at your interview. So, what's your standard day like working here? And we always say, oh, that question again. Goodness. Well, is it summer? Is it winter? Is it spring? It really depends. And it's so nice to have a job like that that's really variable, and just to get to meet so many people through our work that are having these exciting experiences.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our panelists.
That was a fascinating start to the discussion. And one of the things that was interesting to me that we saw repeatedly was this element of serendipity. I don't think that anyone on the panel really started out, when they were 17 years old saying, I'm going to study Russian for this particular purpose and I'm going to end up in this particular place. Russian became an important element in all of your careers, but it also opened doors that you couldn't even have known about before. So thank you very much for talking about that. I think maybe I'll help field questions here, and we want to open it up, and there are questions from the panelists, and I will try to keep an eye out and see who has questions for our panelists. Yes.
I'll just throw this to the whole panel. I'm interested in what I'll broadly describe as working in geopolitical strategy and consulting, but for familial reasons, it's looking like I'll have to move to Australia in the next few years. So I was wondering if any of you knew of any particular Russian investment or involvement or interest in the Australasian region and the job opportunities that could be there.
Australia produces a huge amount of butter and lamb, for which Russia has traditionally been a huge consumer. So in my years in Moscow, there was constant delegations coming in to negotiate about pricing and supplies. Now, I don't know where that sits now. I don't know if Australia is under sanctions, imposing sanctions, and therefore, if there are Russian counter-sanctions saying, no, we can't have your lamb. But again, these things are, we hope, transitory, and that we're not going to go into a world where everybody's in little isolated pockets sanctioning each other forever.
I was going to say it's probably something to do with natural resources. A couple years back, some of my soldiers were leaving the military and they were looking at jobs in Central Australia, like in the quarries, digging up natural resources. So I don't know personally, but maybe research something like that.
To use the power of LinkedIn, and just type in Australia, type in Russia, and see what you come up with. You probably maybe surprised there would be alumni from this program who are over there, trying to tap into other people with similar background to you. I mean, from what I understand, there is a pretty big Russian diaspora in Australia, so that's definitely something to look into.
Other questions? I actually had a comment I wanted to make in response to one of the things that Stephen Halliwel said. You said that things change quickly in Russia, and that struck me because as far back as around early 1800s, Pushkin made the same comment, and this was kind of a truism of Romantic historiography. The Romantic writers who wrote about Russia commented on the fact that because power was so concentrated in a few people at the top level of society, that does lead to a certain unpredictability. And I think that all of these careers actually reflect that unpredictability in some ways. And that is something that keeps it very interesting. 6 years ago, how many of us would have thought that we would be talking about Russia the way we are now, that we'd be talking about Crimea the way we are now, that we'd be talking about US election involvement the way we are now. And that's something that I think keeps people going in this field. And again, it seems like it's reflected in all of these careers as well.
Just to follow up on
Yeah.
that just a little bit, I think the situation in Ukraine has come up as a relevant piece of the picture. If you have an interest in Europe, Europe is, I think, being redefined at this point in time, in part by Brexit, in part by the Catalonia situation, but much more importantly by the future of Ukraine. Because from a Russian perspective, that's part of the homeland. And to see that country begin to identify as a member of the European community is deeply threatening to the people who are trying to hold power over it. And I think it's equally clear that the United States is not about to walk away, nor are the European powers and allow Ukraine to slip back into the sort of vassal relationship to Moscow that dominated the Soviet period. So if you have the Russian skill and the sensibility of looking at political change as Europe is going to evolve, you have a special handle to bring to that situation. I think we've completely underestimated how deep that crisis is. Crimea is in some very basic sense Russian. It's historically Russian. And yet Ukraine is full of people who are saying, we're not going to play to dance to the Russian tune any longer. We want to be part of it. And that's so threatening to Putin because it's another Slavic people this time basically saying it's possible to participate in the world and have transparency and enforceability in courts and an independent judiciary and all those things we take pretty much for granted here. He no longer has the mandate from his own people that he would want when they can see that happening next door. So I think Ukraine will figure in your future is very important.
I think that's an excellent point. Were you going to say something about that, Carey?
So I want to bring up two different things actually, but one was keyed by reading the flyer on careers in Russian and the advantages NYU offers. And one of them, which I think is legitimate, 45-minute subway trip and you're immersed in Russian culture. We had a group of immigrants from the Civil War in Florida, so we would have tea every month or so with this group of fairly elderly people at that point. So we're a century from the Russian Revolution, and they had witnessed it, and we thought it was wonderful. It was great. It was conversation. It was very embarrassing to be in Moscow and then Leningrad and use 50-year-old slang and not have a clue why everybody burst in laughter every time you would say very simple expressions. So what I want to do with that plug is there's no substitute for being there. And I think what you heard from almost everybody up here is the real difference it makes to physically being in the place where they speak, everybody speaks the language and is of that culture. It really helps personally to get you into it, but it also really helps later professionally. It'll be looked at as you apply for jobs as a sign of how sincere your interest in this area is. If you studied it and never went there, it's a gap, so think about that. The other thing I think is that I heard this as everybody talked about both their Russian experiences and their language experiences, but their careers, is the importance of adding Russian to something. It becomes a skill, a subset of skills that's really important, but it's going to be important combined with art history or economics or international studies or even military service. But you need to think of that other part. And for a lot of the better jobs, or almost all of them perhaps, you'll need to think about graduate work. And I think you heard that across the board from the panel as well. And there can be serendipity in that. You may find the graduate works in an area you hadn't really expected to do, but you may need to think about how do you take the Russian that you may have had as an undergraduate and then build on that to something that combines well. And German and Russian go together really well. So, excellent. The only reason I speak German is the State Department view was, we already know you do well in Russia, so we won't send you there. We'll send you to Berlin where you don't know anything, and we'll teach you German and see how do you do overseas with a new culture, and it was a very different culture, in a new language, and it was a very different language. And then once I'd done that, then of course you go to Moscow. But look at things that combine with your interests well, and I think that also leads to a happier life.
I think we had a question.
I'm a psychology major and a Russian heritage speaker. I would really like to do some work in Russia, but I worry that mental health care really isn't a concern in Russia, not really on the radar, and also that kind of a Western psychology education isn't always relevant in Russia. So I was just kind of questioning for the panel at large, how would you combine Russian language and psychology as a career?
I could think of a whole bunch of different ways. So I mentioned NGOs. We have NGOs now going into regions of the former Soviet Union that were at war with one another. So Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Georgia itself, Moldova, Transnistria, trying to deal with the psychological effects of that fighting on people and how to rebuild those societies. That with Russian language would be a perfect combination.
I can speak to my personal experience while I was reporting in Russia on the Russian anti-abortion movement, and I got to see with my own eyes the way psychology works in that specific environment, especially concerning issues such as women's health. And I think they definitely, there's like a small group of Western style psychologists that I think are doing like great work in that respect. There is a lot of still misinformation and just sheer ignorance when it comes to specific aspects of psychology, and I saw that in particular looking at anti-abortion issues and the anti-abortion movement. There are a lot of psychologists that have become sort of warriors for the anti-abortion cause, and they do this in a very systematic way. They have agreements with the government. They enter hospitals and offer their counseling support to women, and their type of counseling is, of course, is not a neutral counseling. It has specific type of goals. But I do know of also a lot of other psychologists that are very aware that this is an issue and have been trying to work really hard to counter it. So I think there is, some people have like a much better understanding than others, but I think there is space to work together.
And as far as even just public interest, I mean, I was in Moscow a couple of weeks ago, and there were articles in the paper about mental health. I mean, it's not a completely off the radar issue. Their understanding of what constitutes mental health is obviously going to be different, but it was certainly something that was in the public discourse.
There's a group at CIA working on Putin. Why he takes his shirt off so often, seen with tigers and rides on horses. But I mean, there are places, these combinations become more important than you'd think.
And yeah, also another thing would be like with LGBT work, a lot of those centers and those nonprofits that work with LGBT, they do need a lot of support from people that are trained to do their job properly. Most of these people have gone through like major traumatic experiences, so that would be another.
Aren't those centers under constant attack by government?
They are,
They are.
but they still somehow manage to liberate like all the people that they managed to get through Europe through from Chechnya, for example. I mean, this is something that is very recent, and they do a pretty amazing job considering how limited their resources are.
One thing I wanted to remember to say in response to something Ambassador Carey mentioned is that there really are funding opportunities for graduate work in Russian, including Russian and art history, Russian and psychology, Russian and, I mean, the U.S. federal government paid for my 9-year PhD in comparative literature. When I basically focused on Russian Romanticism, and they paid for it. Right? And I wasn't lying about what I was going to do. It's that they want Russian speakers, right? And that is still the way it is. And so there are opportunities for funding, no matter what you want to do in Russian, even if you don't want to do Russian Romanticism. Okay, so other questions? Yeah.
First, I just want to say thank you again to all the panelists. This was very useful. I had a question for Melissa, actually. How exactly does the job placement work with the fellowship program?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we work with a partner organization in Moscow, and so they're on the ground helping fellows with their placements. I always tell people who are interested in applying to the program to talk to alumni, talk to current fellows about how they got their placement, because every single fellow has a different story. This is Moscow, so things happen, how they happen there. One fellow was on a train, struck up a conversation with someone, and that led to his placement. We have other fellows who have a they've already kind of done, they know somebody, we had somebody actually who was in environmental law, and wanted to work at a very specific firm in Moscow. Got in there, and she was realizing that first-year associates in Moscow work 18 hours a day versus 13 only in New York. And she said, you know, I'm a fellow. I don't have to do that. I don't have to kind of prove myself the same way they do. And so through the language school, I ended up meeting somebody who was working with KfW. It's a German carbon fund, and ended up working with that person for 2 days, and then going back to this law firm for 3 days. So she kind of balanced it out. Finding that placements are like finding a job. So we want fellows who go in and talk to a lot of different companies, make sure it's a good fit. We've got both ways. So some fellows will just work together with the Moscow office and find their placement, you know, through the support of the program. But definitely, if you're interested in applying, is talk to alumni, and specifically, you can always send me an email with what your field is, and I can connect you with alumni to talk about how they got their placement.
So I had a question. I'm not really sure like who exactly to direct it towards, but so my history is in dancing, and although we know like Russia is very rich in terms of its culture and its support to the arts, I think a lot of the attention is still on the fine arts specifically. And so kind of like, where do you see the future in, I guess in some senses, exporting Russia's perspective on the arts, because of like the deep commitment they have to like music training, dance training, and then also they have a very blossoming contemporary art scene. Especially in design in like Moscow and St. Petersburg, you see a lot of people coming up with these different ideas, like Kolsherovchinsky, like he's a great designer that although his things aren't different, he's changing the way people look at Central Eastern Europe in terms of their contribution to art. So just, I guess, where do you see the development for how we can take Russian art, whether it's the methods or the new ideas, and like where there could be potential career growth in those fields?
Sure, I can start off. That's great. I love your comment. I love your question. I love Gosha. He's blowing up on the fashion radar, you know, in London and Paris and New York. And he's definitely, let's say, branding himself in this sort of post-Soviet, yet at the same time, somewhat nostalgic, somewhat kind of harnessing these relics or remnants of like what Soviet style was, and he's doing it really smartly. He's, you know, branding it and selling it for lots of money. I like to believe in partnerships. I worked almost 4 years in the global art program at the Museum of Modern Art, and what we were doing and still are doing is building relationships with different institutions in Russia, forming partnerships, forming exchanges. So as we're both learning from each other, making it a two-way street. And those exchanges are usually well funded and well supported by private funds primarily. And so it gives like both sides of the party a chance to talk and sort of share, you know, what they're doing. I think I mean, it's hard, you know, you say exporting, you know, from Russia to the U.S. I mean, I think there is great interest here in the U.S. in Russian art. I mean, especially in the centenary year. I mean, it is a moment, but, you know, everyone's doing an exhibition on Russia. Everyone, you know, is somehow marking this anniversary. I think, you know, you can still engage with it without having to move to Russia or to find a job in Russia. I think, you know, the market in art has, let's say, crashed a bit. There was a moment, you know, in the mid to late 2000s where Russian art was booming, and places like Sotheby's and Christie's opened up departments of Russian art and have since closed those departments. But you know, as it's been discussed today, there's a lot of wealth in Russia, and a lot of it is moving out of it. And you know, tangible things like artworks are very attractive, especially if they are in different centers like London or New York. So I don't know, keep your eyes open, try to look for collaborations. There are many cultural institutions like I know in London there's Pushkin House, which works across the arts, supporting programming. You have the Jordan Center here, you know, at NYU. So I would just say harness your network and try to collaborate as much as possible.
Can I add to that you're in a period now where this isn't very visible? So there used to be a lot of this. 8-10 years ago even, you would have found collaborations going on between ABT and the Bolshoi or the ballet troops in Leningrad. The trouble with Russia has put all of that down. So a lot of the standard exchanges just
and
aren't
foreign
there.
funding has been
And
taken.
funding is taken, and they're under sanctions.
Look at CEC Arts Link. CEC Arts Link is a great organization based here in New York that does exchanges between performers and artists in not just Russia, but in the whole former Soviet sphere. But they too have come under Trust for Mutual Understanding, which is another nonprofit based here in New York. Very small staff. They do such good work sponsoring exchanges of theater troops, of dance troops. Again, major funding cuts. They're operating on like shoestring budgets.
Yeah. But 15 years ago, we would have been looking for people here to help organize American dance to go there. And it would have been a perfect opportunity. And I guess where you started with buy and hold, have the specialization and wait for the politics to change. Because it'll change. There's a pendulum in this. And then a lot of those things will come back. We are at the State Department not hiring people right now. The President put them under a hiring freeze. Secretary of State says, yeah, we don't need anybody. We're going to fire everybody. Well, even in the United States, you only get to be president 8 years. When he's not president, that's going to be totally changed. We're going to be screaming for people. These other entities will be screaming for people. And there won't be, actually, you'll be in a good spot potentially, there won't be a lot of competition around where people could say, oh, I did this. I was the one who set up that big exchange in Siberia and a traveling troop for 6 months. But there are some still there, and I guess that would be the other piece. Did you guys send anybody to Kazakhstan for the expo?
I think that one of our assistant professors was there, although I'm not
Because
sure.
we had some
Yeah.
students go do that. And,
Yeah.
you know, the United States had a pavilion, and they were desperate to find Russian
Yeah.
speakers.
Yeah,
There just
and I
aren't
think
many Kazakh speakers, so they said Russian will work, and you know, we staffed it. We, the United States of America, staffed it with Russian speakers, and it was business, culture, arts, all of it.
I think that's a really important point that, you know, whatever you see now, whether it's in the job market or geopolitically, is not going to be what you see in 5 years. And if you have a strong interest in something and you pursue it, this is when you, what did you call it, buy and hold? Right?
Yes.
This is when you buy and hold. And it's, you know, you're young, it's a good time to buy and hold. If you want to use a different metaphor, you could use the Marxist metaphor of you could be in your era of primitive accumulation, which means this is the moment when you're sort of like piling up resources, you know, connections, knowledge, language skills, which are going to serve you in a different way in a few years, really in a very short time. And another thing I wanted to mention on the side, because it brings together two of the different comments on Ksenia and Melissa, our alumnus who was an Alfa fellow and who has stayed on. His name is Tom Callahan, and he stayed on in Moscow more or less permanently. He's working there as a lawyer now, goes back and forth a bit, but is going to practice law in Russia. But his entire social circle is made up of, quote, young creatives. So, you know, when I was there a couple of weeks ago, I was with him and these other young creatives who are very much in the scene that Ksenia's talking about. Now,
I very much was with Tom
Yes.
on a few trips in Russia ago. Not the last time I was there because
so
it didn't work out, but yeah.
I mean, he works in a law firm, obviously, and you know, makes his living a different way. But there are connections to be made in the arts,
Absolutely, yeah.
Through other avenues as well. And I think that's something to keep in mind for something like dance.
It's just, the infrastructure is different. So when I started going, you know, traveling in Ukraine and in Russia, I was like shocked. I was meeting people who were, you know, 21 years old and they're the director of such and such a gallery, such and such an art space. And I was like, I'm from New York. In New York, you can't be a director of anything until you're at least, you know, 60, and you have like 5 jobs and 100 awards on your resume. But there, I mean, no one else is, you know, working. This social circle, they're supporting themselves, one another. So, of course, you know, if you're making it, if you're building it, you know, it's going to be yours. So you have to sort of negotiate that. You have to sort of understand, you know, where your place would be if you were to integrate into that. Like if you were to, you know, move to Moscow and want to be an assistant curator at Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, what that sort of means in that context. It means something very different than assistant curator at MoMA or some other museum here.
And it is a place where you can get someone's phone number and call them
And
up.
the rest is
And
literally
that's-
history.
It used to be that instead of calling them up, you had to, you know, take the tramway up to their house and knock on the door. But it might be a famous poet who lived there, and if you had an introduction, you could actually show up and meet that person and talk to that person. And that person might help you write a dissertation or get a job. And I think there is still, I mean, you described it as a different infrastructure. It's a different set of connections, and as you figure that out, it can be very rewarding and exciting compared to a place where things are much more codified and rigid, I think.
Yes, I wanted to join Anne and everybody in thanking our speakers. So I think this was very interesting. I found out a lot of new, that I'm not as valuable as a native speaker, I guess. So that valuable job. I want to invite everybody for a little taste of Russia, but I also wanted to let you know, if you are considering combining some interest in politics, journalism, or something else with Russian, I'm going to leave some handouts from the Wasserman Center for Career Development. Unfortunately, their representative was not able to stay here, but she said that she would be happy to meet with you. We can schedule an appointment, we can schedule a time for her to be here for you to visit. They have a lot of materials, and obviously they'll be able to help you to figure out what you want to do with your different interests and what you can start doing right here at NYU. Okay, so I'm going to leave the handouts here, and yeah, once again, a big thanks to everyone.
And thank you to Irina and to Lady for organizing. Thank you especially to our panelists. It was great.